Chapter 61 Good morning sir, you are listening at Novel Full. Audio. He suspected that this had been the original plan of the interior decorator. Xavier couldn't deny it, it had all panned out well. As Xavier sat up on the feathered bed, as was his normal routine every morning, he mentally went over the series of events that had transpired over the last couple of days. Aside from the unfortunate incident with the hunters which had threatened to soil Xavier's accomplishments, Xavier was pretty much satisfied with how it had all gone down. He had come to this town only a few weeks ago, and within that period, he had managed to take out some of the most significant troublemakers in this town. It hadn't been his original plan, but his character which often acted as his guidance system had led him in that direction. Xavier wasn't one to praise himself. He saw it as a needless indulgence of one's ego. But unknown to him, at that very moment, right outside his hotel were droves of people who had come out to pay homage to him. They had heard of his exploits, and because there wasn't a single member of the town who hadn't been affected by the scourge that was the goblins and orcs, they all trooped in droves to see the man who had accomplished such an unimaginable feat all by himself. Several theories flew around concerning him. Some said he was a demigod, others claimed he was a very powerful mage, a branch of left-winged extremists claimed he was an extraterrestrial angel who had been assigned to their town to take care of their beastly woes. Xavier's black garments didn't help matters one bit. His cold eyes further enhanced the aura of mysteriousness around him. The tale-bearers took advantage of this to spin more stories. Whatever it was, they had all trooped down in the masses to see the mysterious man. It was probably a good thing that Xavier had chosen that very day to skip town. He wasn't the type of man who loved attention. He left that for politicians and socialites. He was a solider, and for him, that was enough. L.RG back in his hotel room, still unaware of the crowd that awaited him outside, Xavier packed up his gear and headed downstairs to the lobby. Xavier saw the eccentric hotelier waiting for him at the foot of the stairs and rolled his eyes. He wasn't in the mood for the extra character of the hotelier this morning. After settling him the last time, Xavier had hoped he wouldn't have to deal with the obnoxious hotelier. So, Xavier breezed past him, hoping that if he ignored the hotelier hard enough, he would take the hint and go. It proved to be a serious miscalculation. Xavier's coldness seemed to be lost on the loud fellow. The hotelier greeted Xavier boisterously. "Good morning, sir." Xavier grunted an inaudible reply. The hotelier refused to be deterred by Xavier's coldness, instead he pressed on optimistically. Actually, the hotelier had only recently realized that the mysterious stranger had recently come to stardom. So, with this last few moments to spare, he tried to ingratiate himself with Xavier. "Boss man. Since you have been such a model guest, I would like to offer you a lifetime of free services here. Feel free to stop by at any time, sir." Xavier raised his eyebrows quizzically at the hotelier. "Really?" he asked. "Most definitely," he chirped with a beaming smile. Xavier knew that the hotelier didn't really mean it. He could tell that he was the type that loved money more than life itself. The hotelier was simply playing on the fact that Xavier would probably thank him for his benign hospitality and decline his offer. Xavier knew this and decided to play to the left. But much to the hotelier's horror, the exact opposite of what he had been expecting happened. Xavier looked him squarely in the eye, and with a wicked smirk on his face, he replied him, "You know, I might just take you up on that offer." Xavier watched with delight as the hotelier's face turned pale white in shock before he headed towards the exit where his own shock waited for him in an ambush. The doors opened, and it felt like the floodgates were unleashed. Completely unaware of the storm that awaited him outside, Xavier casually strolled out only to be accosted by a barrage of strangers. Their benign looks and worshipful stares took Xavier by storm. Far and wide, as far as the eye could see, scores and scores of people were littered on the street. Xavier felt like he had walked into his worst nightmare. He could handle a whole band of goblins, he could break even with a dozen orcs, but he couldn't deal with the politics of having to deal with human motions. Xavier was hardly ever taken unawares, but there was no way he would have known that this would happen. Momentarily frozen in disbelief, Xavier stood on the pavement as he watched the street before him teem with fans. It was hard to ignore the longing looks of adoration that was generously spread across their faces. The confounded Xavier still had no idea what this was about. And worse of all, there was no one he personally knew in the crowd, so why were they all staring at him like he was Santa or something? By the looks of it, it seemed like the whole town had come to see Xavier. A couple of hunters who had personally seen Xavier at the underground keep stepped out from the throng of people in the street and walked up to Xavier with beaming smiles and outstretched arms. It was only after a few sentences that Xavier finally understood. The first of the four young men congratulated Xavier with words of adulation, "Well done, champ. You're a real one. Indeed. Thank you for all your services to this town. We can't thank you enough." Yes. Those orcs sure had it coming. The nasty goblins as well. The others echoed the last man's statement in approval. Even though the hunters did not like the way Xavier did things, there was no denying the fact that his ways delivered results. For the hunters, this was a huge leap. From not liking Xavier at all to coming to admire him, there was no doubting the fact that they had had a 180-degree shift in their perception of him. It was evident in their beaming smiles and their approving looks. It was at this point that Xavier finally caught on. He sighed a deep relief and finally eased himself into the situation. Drawing a deep breath, Xavier dove into the crowd. This was the best and easiest way to escape the situation. If he had lingered too long on the pavement, he would have been asked to deliver a speech. Anyone who knew Xavier would testify that he wasn't exactly the speaking type, so addressing a crowd on such short notice was way out of his scope of expertise. Like a tiger in its element, Xavier navigated his way through the crowd, smiling, waving and pausing for the occasional handshake or hug. It was like watching an animal in its natural habitat. He truly was in his element. As Xavier made his way through the throng of adoration, his eyes searched thoroughly for a familiar face. In particular, he looked for the simple chubby face of the young woman whom he had gotten along with in his time here. But the more he searched, the more convinced he was that Tacy wasn't present. At some point, he thought he sighted someone whose features vaguely resembled that of Tacy's. But disappointment mocked him the moment he raised his hopes up. It turned out that it wasn't her. Just about 40 feet away from Xavier, positioned way behind the crowd, and standing at the street corner of was the same person whom Xavier was longing to see. With sad eyes, Tacy quietly watched Xavier's tall frame waltz through the multitude. Tacy was the impulsive type, and naturally, hesitation had never been part of her character. But in that moment, much like her eyes, Tacy's body language screamed of reluctance. Hers was a longing that was tempered by raging winds of inferiority complex. She desperately wanted to reach out to Xavier in that moment, and for a jiffy, she almost did. But the encompassing mental barriers of doubt and the fear of rejection kept her from doing that which she wanted to do with the man she yearned for. So, like a schoolgirl watching her crush from a distance, Tacy maintained a physical and emotional distance from Xavier. Amidst the cheering and appreciative speeches flying all around her, Tacy remained detached from the happenings. Instead, she remained in the protective shell of her own mind. Not daring to come out. Not daring to act out. With arms folded, she simply looked on from a distance with the keen eyes that resembled that of a hawk. Chapter 62 Carriage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Unknown to Tacy, just as she kept her eyes fixated on Xavier from a distance, another pair of keen watchful eyes also observed her. From the balcony of the building opposite Tacy, the proprietor of the underground keep watched his ward from behind the curtain. Despite the ruckus below, Caden's eyes remained on Tacy. Caden, being an old man, recognized the longing look in his ward's eyes. This was a look he had seen frequently during his lifetime. From his experience, this was the look that preceded the advent of the kind of pain one could only pray not to feel. That was a look of deliberation, a look of one pondering whether to do, or not to do. And so, while every other person mooned over Xavier, Tacy's eyes, soul and mind remained on Xavier, and Caden in turn watched Tacy very carefully. This was a triangle in which none of its parties were fully aware of, aside from Caden of course. Caden made it his business to know everything, but the great burden that came along with knowledge was knowing when to act on it. Caden did not speak, he simply watched the scene. In the open street, on the ground below, Xavier was beginning to lose hope that he would see Tacy in the crowd. The time for his departure was at hand and he felt strangely vulnerable. As time passed, the magical cloud of euphoria began to dissipate. Xavier found himself getting repulsed by the gathering. The novelty of the encounter was starting to wear off. This eerie feeling was probably enhanced by the fact that Tacy hadn't come to see him off. He tried to make excuses for her in his head, but even he knew that he sounded pathetic. So, his towering form eased his way through the throng of mediocre people, his eyes desperately searching for a way out. Just in the nick of time, the fates provided him the escape they needed. Just a few meters ahead, right up the end of the street, Xavier spotted a gathering cloud of dust. He wasn't quite yet familiar with the modes of transportation that was common in this time, but if he was, he would have known that the gathering storm was as a result of the horse-drawn carriage that was headed his way at full speed. Xavier looked on curiously, and soon enough, his eyes picked out the two leading horses trotting down the road energetically. Xavier wasn't a horse guy, but even he could tell that the black majestic steeds were regal in nature. Their jet-black manes whipped in the air gloriously. Their nostrils flared open as they drew and exhaled deep breaths. Their powerful muscular legs hit the ground again and again, in sync, and at a comfortable pace. Xavier couldn't take his eyes off the encroaching sight. As the elegant contraption drew closer to Xavier, the crowd which had flooded the street began to shuffle out of the way, hurriedly scurrying on their feet in a bid to avoid getting crushed by the carriage. Carriages were a sign of the opulent in these times, and because the class system was still prevalent in those days, most regular people avoided them like a plague. Indeed, the driver didn't seem to regard any of the souls who were littered all over the road. Whip in hand, clad in a black overcoat, and with a sinister-looking top hat, he drove furiously, whipping and urging the horses on. Hi-ya-ya. Hi-ya-ya. Undeniably, the driver was fuming. There was no denying the thought that he was more than willing to run over anyone who was foolish enough to stand in his way. Like the ecclesiastical Jewish character Moses who parted the Red Sea, carriage driver braved through the crowd, forging a path of his own as he progressed. Xavier noticed that he drove with the air of one who was on an important assignment. As he approached, Xavier saw that this was no ordinary carriage. It looked brand new, official and well taken care of. Aside from the horses, its shiny black metal frame glistened under the mild rays of the morning sun, reflecting and, somehow, absorbing the golden rays. On its windows were solid black curtains which kept the view of the inside obscured from every curious set of wandering eyes. By now, the attention of the crowd had shifted from Xavier to the carriage. Xavier kept his eyes on the carriage, anxious to see the dignitary who had chosen to arrive in such pomp. His curiosity was soon satisfied. Surprisingly, the carriage slowed down, drew to a halt right before Xavier. This only further inflamed the burning fire of Xavier's stardom in the sight of the crowd. The people around howled in admiration. Whispers bounced around as a fresh wave of gossip and baseless insinuations began to spread. The local folks of the town as well as the hunters began to chatter excitedly. Wow! Can you believe it? See, I told you. The young man, if obviously connected. One young man looked at Xavier and the magnificent carriage and wondered aloud, man, I wish I was him. His friend beside him burst into a hysterical laughter and mocked him, yeah right. You probably need to lose that pot that is gradually forming on your abdomen. Have you ever seen a hero with a potbelly before? Angrily, the other guy retorted, tell that to your father, you good-for-nothing swine. The second dude took it in good faith. Still reeling with laughter, he retorted in an even more vitriolic tone, at least I have a father. Look at you, a pot-bellied toad with no hope. No wonder your father left your mother. I'm going to kill you for this. That was just one of the many conversations going on all around Xavier. Clearly, seeing such a magnificent carriage up close, and being in the presence of the living legend, that was Xavier, was too much for them. It took a full minute before the entity obscured behind the black, horse drawn carriage revealed herself. Gracefully, Adelia opened the door of the carriage and poked her head out with a beaming smile on her face. Xavier was shocked. He definitely hadn't been expecting this. Adelia looked nothing like she had looked like the previous day. Her blonde hair had been braided and styled in such a way that it now sat on her head like a golden crown. Her bright blue eyes seemed to shimmer like a pair of blue diamonds. Her pale skin looked refreshed. Even though she was clad in modest apparel, she still looked very appealing. Still looking at her as if she was a different person, Adelia had to break the spell by calling out to him, "Well, what are you waiting for? Please come in quickly. We have a long way to go." As if her words had some invisible power behind it, Xavier found himself moving forward as if compelled by her words. As he walked towards her, in the crowd, he could see the young men nodding their heads approvingly and smiling mischievously. Obviously, they thought Xavier was a playboy as well as a skilled hunter. Just as Xavier was about to enter the carriage, one very obnoxious fellow couldn't resist the urge to shout, "Enjoy yourself, sir." The rest of the males in the crowd took this as their cue and began to cheer Xavier one last time before he left. Xavier cringed. This wasn't the type of attention he wanted. But the crowd just didn't care. As the carriage pulled out of the streets, cries of admiration rang out in volume. It was only after the carriage left the crowd far behind that Xavier was able to breathe freely. It had been a pretty tense morning, and Xavier hoped that he would never actually have to do that again. So, alone with Adelia in the beautiful carriage, Xavier finally came around to his environment. The interior of the carriage contrasted sharply with its outermost part. It was completely overlaid with crimson cushions, making Xavier feel like he was on the inside of a giant watermelon. Every time the carriage hit a bump, the shock was absorbed by the comfortably soft cushions. It was a pretty small and compact space. But in all its allure, it paled when compared to the smiling blue-eyed blonde sitting across Xavier. Truly, Adelia seemed to have transformed. She watched Xavier gingerly as he drank in his new environment with those suspicious eyes of his. In the short time she had known Xavier, Adelia admitted to herself that she had never seen him be at ease before. So, determined to break this cycle, she broke the silence with the ideal icebreaker. "What's his matter, Xavier? Never been in a carriage before." Not sure of what to make of this, Xavier simply shook his head. "You can relax, Xavier. It's like I'm going to eat you or something." Chapter 63 Laughter. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier simply bore into her with an intense glare. "Wow, I have seen you take out an entire band of orcs, I have seen you come back from a killing spree, but I don't think I have seen you this uncomfortable before." In a low and subdued tone, Xavier quietly asked her, "What's this about Adelia? Why am I here, and more importantly, where am I headed?" Feigning frustration, Adelia sat back dramatically and folded her arms across her chest as if she couldn't believe he had just asked her that. "Wow! You didn't even thank me for saving you from the very dangerous situation you had just found yourself." Failing to realize that this emotional blackmail was just a form of Adelia's teasing, Xavier suddenly began to feel a bit bad. "My apologies for my tactless attitude." Xavier began apologetically. But Adelia wasn't down for that. She interrupted him with a smirk on the edges of her lips and a mischievous smile. "Heavens," she exclaimed. "Are you always this serious, Xavier? I was just pulling your legs." Xavier's cluelessness washed away with the realization that followed. Mentally, he rebuked himself for falling for such an obvious snare. A soft smile slowly formed on his face as he began to embrace the warmth of the easy-going atmosphere. "Very funny, Adelia. Truly hilarious," he said sarcastically. Adelia smiled. Not because what Xavier said was funny, but because she had managed to make him smile. As the carriage sped up and left the town in the dust behind them, Xavier finally asked the question that was on his mind. "Seriously, Adelia, where are we headed? We've already left the town behind us, so clearly your destination seems to be out of town. Care to share?" Adelia observed him for a brief second, wondering whether to keep fooling around or actually get serious. The blonde girl chose the latter. "Relax, there's no need to get apprehensive. Did you see the insignia at the front of this carriage?" Before he mounted the carriage, Xavier recalled seeing something vaguely similar to an insignia. "Yes, but what of it?" "Well, a very important government official has requested to see you." "What?" "Forgive me for springing this up on you like this, but it was really short notice." Xavier stared at her with a blank expression. "Don't you think you should have mentioned this earlier?" She looked at his already packed bag and pointed at. "You look like you're already going somewhere. My guess is you're skipping town. Providence." Truth be told, Xavier hadn't just been planning to skip town, he also didn't have any destination in mind. His plan had just been to drift along, hoping to run into another adventure on the way. So, when Adelia filled him in, he was a bit relieved. "So, where did you say we were headed again?" Adelia smiled one of those her satisfactory smiles. "Oh, Xavier. You're going to love it. We are heading to the top city in the state capital. The beautiful, stunning and aesthetically pleasing Victoria City located in the heart of Princey State." Xavier took all this information in, and noted the excited manner with which she had announced the news. As the two journeyed on, Adelia gave him an abridged version of what to expect at the state capital. In very lucid details, and without sparing words, she described the allure of Victoria City. "Oh, Xavier." She purred patronizingly like a kitten. "You really need to see magnificent Victoria City. Trust me, it's nothing like the backwater town we just left. Believe me when I tell you that compared to Victoria City, that town was just a pile of cow dung." When she saw that Xavier had raised his eyebrows in response to her crude analogy, she immediately apologized. "Please pardon my profane language there, but Xavier, I meant everything I said. Victoria City is a hub of commerce. It is the literal embodiment of an urban utopia. It is." Adelia spent the next hour eulogizing the city like it was a living entity. It was clear from her tone that she was in love with the city itself. She spoke of its comely ambience, its sophisticated architecture, its elegantly designed buildings, and amongst other things, its high-end luxurious standard of living. As she narrated and described, the words poured out like honey on a silver platter. Xavier wasn't one for exaggerated details, but there was something undeniably compelling about the way she described the city. She almost made it come alive in that little carriage. This somewhat made the journey a little less tiresome. No doubt, Xavier's interest was piqued. As he listened to her tales and vividly descriptive words, there was no denying the fact there was a lot of color and flair. But this wasn't what Xavier wanted to hear. As he looked out of the window of the carriage and watched the trees rush by, his mind wandered off as he thought deeply on the one thing that interested him the most about this capital city. Coincidentally, it was the one thing that Adelia had managed to overlook. The military system of this particular city. He was a soldier at heart. So, understandably, this was the part of the city that he was driven to. Xavier knew it was probably a long shot, but if Adelia's exaggerations were true, then he expected some innovative advancements in the aspect of the defense and military system of the city. This made sense, seeing that such an urban utopia had thrived in so many other areas. As Adelia's sing-song voice chatted away in the background, Xavier's mind gradually shut her out and instead marinated on the numerous possibilities. One particular aspect that pricked Xavier was that of the mages and the soldiers with traditional weapons. Having spent a significant amount of time in this world, Xavier had seen some pretty inexplicably things. Though he hadn't fully grasped the concept of most of these things, Xavier could confidently say that magic existed. And not only did it exist, it was actually potent enough to interfere with the physical realm as well as alter facts and results. So, with a city that had developed so far despite being in this timeline, Xavier expected some resourcefulness in this aspect. The blend of the magical and the physical was definitely something to look forward to seeing. Also, Xavier was also worried about the advantages and disadvantages, as well as the differences, between the sealing magic of this other place and the most potent weapons in the human world. Naturally, Xavier wasn't willing to bank on these doubts and offload them on the back of such a beautiful woman. Once again, Xavier feasted his eyes on the physical features of the exotic beauty that was riding with him in the carriage. Even as her mouth vomited words and her face lit up in excitement, Xavier saw her in the light of her beauty again. Adelia was truly a stunningly beautiful creature. She was simply breathtaking. Xavier couldn't blame the males in the crowd who had whistled when they saw her beckon on him to come. In their sight, it probably made sense that such an angelic beauty would be reserved for a mysterious guy like Xavier. A desirable woman who was equipped with a sexually charged atmosphere could definitely provoke the interest of any man. Xavier came to sudden realization that if Adelia wanted to, she could easily use her beauty and elevate herself from the position of a servant girl to that of a well-kept mistress. But that simply wasn't her. Spiritually, mentally, and psychologically, Adelia was a rare gemstone. By all count, her resilience was one of the most intoxicating things about her. Xavier knew this firsthand because he had spent close to 48 hours with her in jungle, under the most extenuating circumstances. And yet, not 1 minute had passed when she complained, gave up or fled. She had conducted herself in a manner that was more than appropriate. Unflinching, stubborn and determined up till the very end. Despite her glowing beauty, it was very clear that Adelia wasn't just an ornamental vase, neither was she just a trophy that was easygoing on the eyes. She was deep. Indeed, like a surreal piece of art, Adelia possessed a surreal ambiguity that made her different. And as Xavier found himself boring her being with the psychoanalysis, he found himself actually admiring her with every passing second. As an old-timey soldier that was equipped with a new age attitude, Xavier found it very easy to flow with Adelia. Much to Adelia's surprise, she found out that the stuck-up killer who sat before her was such a funny guy. Xavier very nearly killed her with jokes. He employed every joke he had in his arsenal and ravished Adelia with jokes and amusing stories. Adelia laughed so hard that at one point, she felt her soul leave her body. Chapter 64 Arrive. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Without having an actual orgasm, Xavier had managed to get her to climax. She rocked the carriage with laughter, trembling hysterically as Xavier ambushed her with all the jokes in his literary arsenal. Every step of way, for the remainder of the journey, the carriage was filled with the roaring laughter of the young girl. Adelia's laughter was genuine. Not withholding any atom of conceit or deceit, it was pure. As pure as her intentions were towards him. After several days of traveling together on the road, both of them finally came close to their destination. They hadn't arrived yet, but they were very close. At this point Xavier disembarked from the carriage to stretch his legs and drink in the scene. After riding in the cramped space for days, he was just itching to get over with this journey as soon as possible. So, he asked Adelia, "Adelia, I'm thinking of ditching this carriage and using my armor motorcycle to complete the rest of the journey. You can point me to our destination and the coachman will follow behind, of course." Adelia poked her head out of the carriage. "Armor motorcycle?" she asked with a puzzled frown. Xavier thought she didn't know what he meant, so he gestured with his hands, describing it and making vroom vroom sounds with his mouth. Adelia waved him off casually. Of course I know what you mean, silly. I was just being sarcastic. Xavier narrowed his eyes. That's not fair. Well, I am sorry. But I didn't think you were being serious when you suggested that. Really? Why not? She looked at Xavier like she didn't believe he had just asked her that question. Well, for starters, your motorcycle looks like a weapon. Xavier's blank look showed that either he didn't get what she was trying to say, or he simply didn't care. Knowing him, she was pretty sure that the latter was the case. Adelia, I recall you saying that this was a pretty advanced city. I don't think my armor motorcycle would be a problem here like you think. Besides, I think we can cover much ground speed-wise. She shook her head disapprovingly. Xavier, not everything is about efficiency. You should really consider getting more research done on the word finesse, you know. Finesse. That carriage is damn slow. What's so great about that? The coachman poked his head in their direction as if Xavier had just maligned the love of his life. Xavier saw his concerned look and waved at him. No offense to you and your carriage, mister. The coachman grunted and continued to mind his business. You misunderstand, Xavier. Your armor motorcycle has a very aggressive ring to it. To be honest, it does appear a little hostile, not to mention that it's not practical at all, seeing that you can only take 2 people at a time. Xavier got the part about his motorcycle's appearance being a little aggressive, especially to strangers who had never seen anything like it before. Sensing that she had backed Xavier into a corner with her logic, she pressed on relentlessly. Besides, in this place, the exclusive carriage is an honor. You do recall how the crowd reacted when I came to pick you up, right? Very reluctantly, Xavier began to see reasons with her. She smiled encouragingly. Brace up, Xavier, no need to look so glum. I know you generally shun from lavishness and extravagant treatment. But I suggest you enjoy it. Stop being so all about efficiency all the time. Xavier couldn't help but smile at that last statement. He was actually guilty of that last part. He was hardwired by training to look for the best possible way to handle things. This little friction between them led Xavier to believe one other thing. They were not on the wavelength at all. Xavier did not have the mental bandwidth for any argument, so he simply indulged her. One other thing was clear though, there was obviously a yawning gap between his thought process and that of inhabitants of this Isekai of magic. In order for him to truly immerse himself in the culture of this land, he needed to be fully assimilated. Not just that, he had to accomplish this task as quickly as possible to avoid any further friction and clash of interests. So, learning and observing the customs of this place was imperative. Thus, Xavier tried his best to recollect some of the previous information he had digested about the European culture and mannerisms from the Middle Ages. Back in his own world, Xavier had previously watched his fair share of European Middle Ages themed dramas and films. Because he was also an avid reader, he had also gone through a wide range of literary classics that highlighted this age in terms of fiction. He remembered some of the historical knowledge he had learned from school as well. All of this information which Xavier had previously thought to be useless began to surface with lightning speed as Xavier called them from the deepest reaches of his memories. Xavier entered the coach absent-mindedly, and for the rest of little time they had left, Xavier delved deeper and deeper in his knowledge bank, hoping to draw out any useful information that could be relevant to his present situation. While he was still totally immersed in his own thoughts, the voice of driver of the coach jerked him back to consciousness. Gentleman and lady. Behold, the city of Victoria. Like a child on a holiday trip, Adelia excitedly stuck out her head through the window, and with a smile on her face, welcomed the familiar sight of towering walls of the city. Her excitement was contagious. Soon, Xavier couldn't resist the urge again. He waited for a full minute before engaging his curiosity. Since Xavier took the window facing east, he decided to take the other window facing west. He shifted the curtain gingerly and poked his head to finally see the city that Adelia had been raving about. He wasn't disappointed, but he wasn't overly impressed either. Undoubtedly, the first thing that hit Xavier was the towering walls. There was just something overpowering about them. He had never felt so insignificant and minuscule in scale before. Much later, when Xavier would reminisce on this moment, he would realize that the walls were intentional. They were designed for other reasons of course, but chief of them being for the sole purpose of architectural intimidation. They were at least 100 feet high. Given the timeline of this world, Xavier couldn't deny that this brilliant piece of construction was a testament of the ingenuity and skill of both the engineers and the builders. When Xavier did finally manage to tear his eyes away from the walls, the next thing that greeted him was the insane amount of lively pedestrians bouncing up and down the well-paved streets. There was a certain quality in the air. Xavier could almost taste it was life itself. Yes. That was just what it was. Though Xavier had only been in the city for all but 5 minutes, it was clear even to him that there was just something about the city that made a person want to live on the edge. To do one's best, to surpass one's limits. This city bore all the semblance of a major metropolis that could definitely stand side by side with the modern cities of his own day. Because it wasn't that different from what he was already used to, Xavier didn't show any trace of surprise of the lingering look of a visiting stranger who was impressed. In reality, as well as drama and movies, this was the norm. For someone whose joy was almost entirely hinged on her homecoming, Adelia was more than thrilled to be back home. After her ordeal at the hands of the orcs, Adelia had longed to return to her homeland to convalesce. The mere thought of the lush streets and the warm atmosphere that awaited her back in Victoria City, filled her with a fresh surge of hope. The horror of having to witness a band of orcs slaughter the entire soldiers who had accompanied her was something that had flipped a switch inside her. The horrendous ordeal of almost getting raped which she had somehow managed to escape had been patrolling the borders of her mind, lingering on the edges of her sanity, threatening to plunge her deep into the inescapable well of self-pity and self-hate. In those dark periods she had trudged through the woods with Xavier on a vengeful mission, she had been unrecognizable, even to her own self. In those days, she had been enveloped by a cold darkness which she thought could only be repelled by the complete annihilation of the orcs. Fast forward to a couple of days later, that coldness had now washed away, and in its place was a bubbling warmth that rose from the depth of her spirit like a spring, and made her shine with a luminescent glow. Chapter 65 Victoria, you are listening at novelfull.audio. As a creature whose primary instincts were to love and care, Adelia longed to share this same feeling of bliss with Xavier. As partners who had gone through the same ordeal, she was well aware of the inescapable darkness that followed one from such an experience. Little did she know that Xavier lived for this darkness. In his line of work, both as a solider and a hunter, the darkness was often a byproduct that came along with the job. But of course, Adelia hadn't envisaged this. She was much too consumed Xavier's healing process that she had failed to factor in this variable. So, when she did manage to take her eyes off the window to glance in Xavier's direction, once again she was met with a cold shock. She turned her back on the window to fully face Xavier, hoping to see the look of awe and wonder in his eyes as he gazed upon her beloved city. But alas, in place of awe and wonder was the cold smug look of indifference which sat on Xavier's fine facial features. Adelia was flabbergasted. This wasn't the reaction she had hoped for at all. Thinking his side of the window as probably hampered by a wall or something, Adelia lowered her gaze and tried to catch a glimpse of Xavier's point of view. And sure enough, as she had suspected, his position actually offered him a very generous perspective of the beautiful metropolis called Victoria City. Stunned with surprise, Adelia didn't know what to think. She wanted to accost him, but logic prevailed, and instead, she began to ponder on the reason behind his calm reaction to such a glorious sight which he was definitely seeing for the first time. Had she misjudged his sense of taste? No, she thought to herself. Even a simpleton from the farthest reaches of civilization will definitely bow in deference to the sophistication of Victoria City. She deliberated further on the subject. But all her theories and suppositions brought her to naught. So, confronted with a dilemma to which she had no solution, Adelia finally decided to approach Xavier on the subject. Adelia could spot a liar from a mile off. This was one of the gifts she had been awarded by life from a very young age. She had been with Xavier long enough to tell that he wasn't a liar. But at the same time, she sensed in him a deep well of secrets. Spurred on by this new line of thought, Adelia coughed uncomfortably, indicating that she was about to speak. Xavier in turn caught on and turned to give her the attention that was due to her. She opened her mouth and her question flew out faster than she had originally intended. "What's a matter, Xavier? You don't look too impressed. Did my beloved city not meet up with your expectations? Does it truly seem so ordinary to you that not even a spark of admiration crossed your face?" Without guile, and without attempting to be coy about it, Adelia dove right in and went straight to the point, hitting the nail on the head. Xavier on the other hand was a bit surprised for several reasons. But primarily, he was surprised that his approval of her city meant so much to her. He was taken aback by the bluntness of her speech, but he quickly found out that he was actually endeared by her openness about the whole thing. Transparency was one of the qualities he treasured the most. And clearly, Adelia had an overabundance of this enviable quality. So, not wanting to disrespect her by being vague, Xavier answered her with the truth. "I didn't mean to blow off your city." He began carefully, "But honestly, where I am from, back in my homeland, this is pretty much the norm. Buildings of this size and magnitude are commonplace there." Xavier made no move to explain further. This was probably one of his most annoying traits. His unwillingness to talk. Like a drone who had just casually dropped a bomb, Xavier acted like what he had just said was so ordinary. Adelia noticed this. Without question, Adelia was shocked. More than ever, the embers of her curiosity were inflamed by the knowledge which was the fire that Xavier had just ignited. She adjusted her sitting position and faced Xavier squarely. Her mind was running with a million questions that needed immediate answers. Just who was this stranger? And more importantly, where was he from? Were all men like him back in his hometown? What sort of place was that? These burning questions filled her heart, leaking out like an overflowing cup, lingering on the edges of her lips, waiting to be unleashed like floodgates holding back a flood. Adelia fought the urge to ask these questions. But she took a deep breath, and once again, etiquette prevailed. It took the entirety of her self-control, but Adelia restrained herself from ambushing Xavier. Despite the fact that they had been through a whole lot, they had only just met. On one level, they could be considered as friends, but on another level, they were very much still strangers. To pry into his past with the eagerness and ravenous hunger of a she-wolf would be densely rude. Not just that, it would be the very definition of inappropriate, completely ruining every chance of her finding out the salacious gist she was so desperate to get. Adelia knew that she had to play the long game. She had to get him to trust her. This was the only hope she had of ever gaining the much coveted information she wanted. So, at the end of the mental deliberation, Adelia found herself saying aloud to Xavier in a quiet voice. "You are a strange one, Xavier, a strange one indeed." Her tone wasn't patronizing. Adelia was simply speaking her truth. Xavier responded by simply shrugging his shoulders. Just as Adelia expected, he made no move to confirm or debunk her claim. She in turn held back herself from spewing. So, the elegant carriage with the magnificent steeds trotted gracefully through the streets of the famous Victoria City. It weaved through the elaborate roads where other carriages like it also moved in a coordinated manner. It was all so neat and tidy really. The whitewashed roads that were reminiscent of the ancient Romans' distinct engineering littered the streets. The pedestrians trekked on opposite sides of the roads and maintained a reasonable distance from the horse-drawn carriages. There were no suffocating carbon monoxide fumes. There were no blaring horns. There was just the steady trotting of horses, and the comforting thuds of numerous feet simultaneously hitting the earth. Combined together, these sounds gave the city its own distinct heartbeat. It was truly metropolitan, but without the perks of the modern world from Xavier's day. From his window, Xavier watched as vendors pitched their stands at vantage points, calling out to folks strolling by, and offering discounts and promos and all the other shenanigans that was typical of salespersons. Newspaper boys stood at the street corners, holding up today's editions and calling out the teasing headlines in loud voices. The buildings on the opposite sides of the roads added to the long list of factors that made the city the urban grove that it was. Xavier couldn't spot any residential houses that looked like duplexes and detached bungalows. No, all he saw was rows and rows of towering buildings that rose from the ground up towards the skyline. Some of these towers were apartment complexes that no doubt housed loft vestibules for the middle and working class. At the bottom of these buildings were lock-up stores, convenience corner stores and a host of other small-scale businesses. When Xavier looked beyond the giant concrete towers, in the horizon, he could see the homes of what appeared to be the upper class. Sitting on the hills, above the hustle and bustle of the regular people, were a string of glowing white manors. Even from a distance, Xavier could tell that those estates were worth a mint. Xavier finally understood why Adelia had been so uptight about this city being the best of the best. For someone like her who had been born in this timeline, Victoria City might have as well been paradise to her. By European Middle Ages standard, Victoria City wasn't bad all. Xavier had been lost in the simple and yet elegant allure of the city that he failed to notice that they had arrived at the gates of the city hall. As they disembarked, Xavier feasted his eyes on the citadel which stood before him. A brilliant-looking official welcomed them at the gates with a benign smile. "Good day and welcome to the city hall. How may I be of service to you?" The young chap sounded like an automaton who had repeated the same generic speech at least 100 times. Chapter 66 Interval. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In response, Adelia merely flashed something that looked like an official seal or insignia. Whatever it was, it sure got the attention of the young chap at the door. He seemed to recognize it as something meaningful and authoritative. Instantly, the young chap called on another one of his colleagues to lead them as he opened the large bronze gates and ushered them in. The city hall had the ambience of a magnificent cathedral. It had all the qualities of an official place of business. Policemen in their shiny pointy hats patrolled in pairs with her sharp eyes scanning back and forth, watching for any sign of acts of misdemeanor. They carried batons, some were tucked under their arms, others hung on their belts. The more proactive officers had them ready in hand, poised for action of any kind. Aside from the enforcers of the law, government officials, clothed in cotton white shirts and frock-like accessories hanging from their necks, exited and entered the building at frequent intervals. Walking briskly with that emergency mentality. Hoarding leaves and leaves of official documents. The ground was tarred neatly with glowing white concrete tiles. Everyone was busy, but one didn't have to look too deep to see the underlying coordination and coherence. The government official led them through the otherwise busy lobby. Xavier expected the whole processing thing to be done at a counter where they could fill in some forms and be on their way. But as the government personnel led them through a door in the hall, and further down a series of complex corridors, Xavier began to wonder if their guide wasn't lost. Xavier's fears were soon abated and they finally arrived at their destination. All the twists and turns had led them to a beautiful, well-decorated, swanky room. The government personnel who had led them this far gestured and pointed towards the seats. The ever-cautious Xavier wasn't as hurried to seat. Adelia on the other took up the offer with gratitude and rushed to sit down immediately. Xavier stood for a moment, admiring and taking in the entire well-laid-out office space. The marble brilliant white stone statues caught his eye. The exquisite furniture, the artworks, the books, and the overall outlook of the room suggested that the owner was a person of class and culture. After a few seconds of observation, Xavier eventually sat down beside Adelia. They both said nothing to each other. The fatigue of their journey seemed to have put a temporary lock on their tongues. It has often been said that olfactory-triggered memories hit the hardest. This proved to be particularly true in Xavier's case. While they waited, Xavier's sharp nose caught the distinct smell of fresh coffee. He fought the instinct to twirl around in search of the source. It was a delicious rich smell that brought back memories. Within a short period, a neatly dressed attendant swaggered in gracefully with a tray of the fine-smelling beverage. He set it down gracefully with a smile on his face and unloaded its contents before both of them. The tray touched the table with a soft clang, and the aromatic steam of the freshly boiled coffee filled the room. Xavier stole a side glance at Adelia, hoping that he wasn't the only one who was captivated by the inviting aroma of the hot beverage. He wasn't disappointed. Imprinted boldly on Adelia's face was the same longing look that mirrored her own yearning desire for the drink. Sharp as a bird, Adelia's eye also caught Xavier looking at her, and she smiled mischievously as a kind of silent agreement passed between them. The attendant who served them was completely oblivious of the duplicitous intentions of both guests seated before him. Outwardly, they seemed to have a bored faraway look in their eyes. But if the attendant had been a little bit more attentive, a closer look at their fingers tapping nervously and their breathing increasing by the second would have revealed a different story altogether. After serving them, the inattentive attendant bowed and excused himself. As soon as the door closed behind him, Adelia descended upon the fancy cups that had been arranged before them. The white ceramic cups were typical of this period. They had golden handles and were overlaid with a decent covering. The trays matched the brilliant white and gold colors. And as if the attendant was aware of their need for more, he left a moderate-sized jug in the tray and beside it, another smaller glass jar containing warm milk to complement the coffee. Of course, a few cubes of sugar had been set aside for them. It truly was the whole package. Not being the type to shy away from a decent beverage, Adelia took one look inside the jug and whistled softly, wee wee. Surprised at her behavior, Xavier shot her a cautioning look. She shrugged her shoulders with an indifferent look and asked him playfully, "What? Don't act like you can't perceive the strong inviting aroma. We deserve this after such a tedious journey." Xavier wanted to point out to her that riding for days on end inside a comfortable horse-drawn carriage didn't count as a tedious journey at all. He wanted to tell her that an example of a tedious journey was having to trek through an unknown terrain for days and night on end, without food, water or shelter. He wanted to educate her on the topic and tell her that she had in fact had it so easy, but wisely, he decided to keep mum. Instead he let her have her day. Adelia reached out to the first cup and gingerly lifted it to her lips to taste it. As soon as she took a sip of the moderately hot drink, Xavier could have sworn that a fresh fire was ignited in her eyes. After the first sip, she brought the cup down with both hands, and with a huge smile on her face, she reported back to Xavier enthusiastically, "Heavens!" She blasted out. "This has got to be the best coffee I have ever had. Oh Xavier, you need to try this. Please try it." Xavier watched her with pleasure as she praised the coffee. Without even asking his permission, Adelia reached out to the second cup with her free hand. She carefully picked it up and handed it to Xavier eagerly, spurring him on as she encouraged him to try it. Without any atom of resistance left in his being, Xavier accepted the offering from her and brought the cup to his lips. He took the first customary sip and immediately, the richness of the tasty beverage went straight to his head, coursing through his body, setting alight and resurrecting every dead thing in him. "Damn! What the hell is this thing?" he wondered aloud. Adelia giggled excitedly. "See? I told you it was good." Xavier couldn't agree more. He was certain that this was the Gucci of coffees. The richness was undeniable. It had been heated to the perfect degree. Not too warm that it was borderline cold, and not overly hot such that it didn't scald his tongue. It was simply perfect. The taste rolled over his tongue with the teasing and yet strong biting taste of a well-brewed cup. Xavier couldn't help but smile. Indeed, there is coffee, and there is coffee. Confirming its deliciousness, Xavier's next sip turned out to be more than a sip. It was a huge gulp. Adelia smirked elatedly as she delved into the milk and poured a generous helping into her already half-empty coffee cup. The two of them had found a guilty pleasure together and they reveled in the moment. The atmosphere was a bit livelier now, so they chatted away as they sipped their delicious beverage. Well, Mr. Xavier, who knew coffee could get you on like this? It is certainly a sight for sore eyes. No need to be so smug about it. I'm not the one who's had 3 cups already. Adelia's eyes blazed defiantly as she retorted with a mischievous grin, hey, don't judge. Xavier laughed at just how quickly she had gone from being on the attack to being defensive. I can't deny it, Adelia. This is some of the best coffee I've ever had. How come you won't take it with milk or sugar? You should really try some with it. If you're worried about losing its original taste, don't worry, the milk actually complements the flavor. Xavier shook his head just as Adelia reached for the jug to pour out another cup. It's not that, Adelia, I have always preferred it straight black. Adelia mimicked his last statement in her best impression of his voice, it's not that, Adelia, I have always preferred it straight black, wow. That is such a corny thing to say. Have you even tried it? Or is it some macho thing? Chapter 67 Run along. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier was about to take another verbal jab at her when he heard approaching footsteps coming from the other side of the closed door. He looked at Adelia and immediately, she also caught the cue. So, mentally and physically, the duo began to prepare themselves to meet their host. In all of 3 seconds, just as the door opened, Xavier's and Adelia's facial expressions were now blank, as opposed to the playful and relaxed expressions that had camped on their faces just a while ago. The cups had been set down neatly as if they had never been touched. Like the wave of a magic wand, the atmosphere in the room had reverted back to its default mood. The cold perfect air that charged the room when Xavier and Adelia had initially came in. Just as the door opened behind them, Xavier and Adelia turned as one in perfect accord and rose respectfully to honor their host. A man in a very impressive uniform stormed into the room. In purposeful and dignified steps, the government official who was of average height strode into the room. He wasn't physically intimidating, but Xavier could tell from the unmistakable aura of authority that surrounded the man that this was a man of authority. Since Xavier was a soldier, his will had been wired over time to conform to rank. So, it wasn't hard to recognize authority. As expected, the man made no move to offer either of them a handshake. They only sat down after he had sat down. Without even bothering to look in Xavier's direction, he looked right past him and focused his intense gaze on Adelia. You're pretty late, miss. His slight pause indicated the fact he had forgotten her name. Adelia picked up on this and chirped in her name to help him remember. Adelia, sir. My name's Adelia. Right. He said absent-mindedly as he pored over some papers on his desk. I have it on good authority that the soldiers who had been assigned to you on your last journey have been killed. Is that so? Yes, sir. He clasped his hands together and leaned back as he shot her a penetrating gaze. How is it that you came to survive then? Adelia took a deep breath and then went on to summarize the events that had transpired. As she spoke, she tried her possible best to keep her voice free of emotion. All through her narration, the government official kept his eyes fixated on her. Not even taking them off for a second. It was a bit disturbing. By the time she was done, Adelia felt like she had just relived the entire thing again. The government official averted his intense gaze from Adelia and shifted his focus to Xavier. So he is the one, he asked Adelia. She nodded. Xavier didn't need anyone to tell him that the government official wasn't impressed. Not in the least. After he took a long hard look at Xavier, he then discussed with Adelia some more. I suggest to get back to the governor's house at once. Berlin has been worried sick about you. The wave of sadness faded away as soon as Adelia received that bit of information. The thought of going to see Erling filled her with so much joy that she momentarily forgot all the horror she had had to go through. The government official left to make the necessary arrangements to transport her. Adelia got up at once, tailing him like a shadow. Xavier, who had been watching the exchange carefully, knew that he had to remain here till further notice. They both bade goodbye to each other, and just as Adelia was about to leave, she lingered at the door and gently cautioned Xavier. A friendly advice, Xavier. Stunned by her odd choice for her last words, Xavier turned to look at her. Don't go wandering around. I know you might be thinking of exploring your new environment, but please don't. You know trouble seems to follow you wherever you go. She emphasized. Xavier chuckled softly. I am not a troublemaker, Adelia. So no need to worry about me, just be safe. But Xavier's assurance didn't seem to hold its weight in Adelia's mind. I am serious, Xavier. We have rules here. So just because you're now a big-shot hero doesn't mean the rules won't apply to you. Don't do anything to dent your honor, okay? Please. Her concern touched Xavier deeply. It wasn't like her to give stern warnings. If anything, it should be the other way around. Xavier didn't know just when their roles had reversed. He assured her one more time in a serious tone, run along now, Adelia, before you run late. No need to worry about me, I'll be fine. She recognized the sincerity in his eyes and knew that her warning had been received. So, she left with her heart at peace. Goodbye, Xavier. She didn't wait for him to reply. Adelia banged the door behind her. The ensuing silence engulfed the room like an ominous presence. Xavier hadn't realized just how alone he was until he heard the steady ticking of the clock in the room. For the first time in a while, he actually had some alone time to himself, and funny enough, he wasn't quite sure what to do with his free time. As an individual, Xavier wasn't a mental weakling, in fact he loved being by himself. But this time around, much to his dismay, he found himself saddled with a glaring hole that echoed back the emptiness that now encompassed him on every side. Unlike his normal self, Xavier began to seek for even the slightest comfort in the dependable noise of the city life outside. He found himself craving even the subtlest of noises. From the steady trotting of the horse-drawn coaches outside to the yelling of pedestrian on the streets. Anything to keep his hold on sanity. But the thick concrete walls of the sturdy structure completely shut out any noise from the outside, making him feel like he had been entombed in a fancy sarcophagus that had been shoved into the bowels of the earth. It was a morbid thought, and an even more horrifying imagination. But at the same time, it was as disturbing as it was comforting. Xavier was obviously ambivalent about the whole thing. Xavier struggled to understand this sudden feeling, and as he did, he mulled over the source of this new development and slowly made his way back to where it had all started from. Xavier blamed it all on Adelia. She had infected him with the biting contagious scourge of friendliness. Before he had met her, Xavier was perfectly fine with being by himself. He had actually thrived on his own. As he reflected on the days that preceded this new development, a deep frown followed by a soft smile of amusement played out on his face. Although it had seemed normal at the time, Xavier discovered that there were days when he could actually go for almost an entire week without uttering a single word. For a man who thrived on the cold embrace of solitude, he had neither the luxury nor opportunity to engage in any kind of conversation. All his mental faculties were focused on enhancing the efficiency of both his psychological and physiological state. Xavier couldn't help but chuckle as he reflected deeply on his personal growth as a social creature. Xavier watched painfully as a whole hour passed. He could literally feel each passing minute drag past him. In that period, no one came to check up on him. He didn't even have the luxury of dozing off for a minute because of the generous amount of rich coffee he had gulped down earlier on. This sent his biochemistry into a turmoil. Xavier's mind was ready to hibernate, but his body had been loaded with the ultimate stimulant that had proven effective over the years. Coffee. There was nothing worse than brimming with an exorbitant amount of energy, only to be confined within a tiny space and with no outlet to expend this insane amount of energy gathering within. As Xavier sat down in the chair, he found his fingers tapping away energetically. He couldn't seem to keep his eyes in one place, they kept darting back and forth across the room. By the end of the first hour, he had virtually memorized just about everything in the room. The effect of the coffee began to kick in with full swing. Xavier was well aware of the fresh surge of enthusiastic energy brewing within him. He thought he could rein it in and channel into a reasonable endeavor, but when no one came, Xavier sprang to his feet with the agility of a cat. Unable to contain his coffee-induced excitement anymore, Xavier began to walk around the room in circles. He went up close to the large portraits hanging on the wall and almost laughed out loud at the funny-looking mannerisms of Europeans from the Middle Ages. Chapter 68 The Secretary. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The photography and artful depictions of the rulers of the city hung on the surrounding walls of the office space, enhancing its official government-like look. It wasn't long before he got bored and shifted on to other things. He flitted through the pile of books on the shelves, ran his fingers over the intricately crafted marble statues and figurines. Still, he was not satisfied. The demand on his body was compelling. As Xavier deliberated on his next source of entertainment, he eyed the open space between the door and the desk, and an idea immediately began to form in his mind. Of course. Why didn't I think of this sooner? Xavier beamed to himself as he began to take off his shirt. He was going to do the one thing he actually enjoyed doing, working out. In addition to the stimulating effect of the coffee, a new dose of adrenaline rushed through him, filling him with an animal-like energy. Within a couple of seconds, Xavier took off his shirt and flung it on the nearby chair. With the office space to himself, and with all the time in the world, Xavier dropped down to the ground, placed himself in a push-up position and began the rigorous process of doing his push-ups. 1, 2, 3. With his face locked in a tight grimace, Xavier began his push-ups with renewed vigor. 70, 70.1, 70.2, 3. By this time, great beads of sweat began to form on his face and on his muscle-bound back. His mind a total blank, Xavier focused 100% on the task he had set out to do. Bursting with energy, he pushed on determinedly till he completed 100. Without even stopping for a break, he started a fresh round of sit-ups. Xavier dove right in, and finessed his way through 90 sit-ups. Just as he was about to complete his 100th sit-up, the door behind him suddenly jerked open. Xavier had been so focused on his workout regimen that for a moment, he forgot where he was. The stranger that emerged from the other side brought him back to reality. Xavier stopped abruptly at the interruption. Bathed in a blanket of his own sweat, Xavier jumped to his feet and turned around sharply to see who the intruder was. Xavier was quite surprised at the figure that met his eyes. On a subconscious level, Xavier had been low-key expecting the same official from earlier on. This made more sense. But instead, he saw a short, pretty woman in transparent glasses standing at the door frame. Despite the awkward and very unconventional sight that greeted her, Xavier observed that she kept a straight face. She was dressed like a secretary. But it wasn't just her dress, it was the way she clutched the neat pile of documents to her chest, holding them like her life depended on them. Her strong, uncompromising look told Xavier that she was one of those particularly strong women. The cold way she regarded him, in addition to her overall serious vibe, reminded Xavier of one of those book-smart, ambitious, academically serious girls in high school who used to run for the office of class president, and garner favors from teachers and authority figures. Xavier was certain that she was the type. Just as Xavier observed her, the mean-looking woman stared him down with an intensity that far outmatched Xavier's. Her eyes drilled into his opponent with the intensity of a high-energy laser beam. Xavier felt increasingly uncomfortable with each second. The excruciating torture that came with the indignation of her gaze was unexpected. Xavier began to get the feeling that she certainly didn't like him. Her insidious glare suggested that she in fact didn't want him here. Never in a million years would Xavier have expected this level of vitriol from a woman of her stature. The awkwardness was further augmented by the fact that Xavier was shirtless in a government office. His muscled frame in fact did not impress her. In fact, she made no attempt to hide her repulsion. Much later, Xavier would realize in retrospect that in the sight of a stranger who was only just seeing him for the first time, he must have indeed appeared to be a dim-witted delinquent. Based on the whole setting, he actually deserved whatever she had thought of and concluded about him in that moment. After a few seconds of the awkward silence and the intense staring, Xavier reached for his shirt and put it on in 2 brief movements. Unlike the aggressively ominous black garments that Xavier usually wore, this time, he was clad in something more local and more peculiar to his environment. But that wasn't enough to cut him some slack in the eyes of the intense woman. Her eyes followed his every movement with cat-like precision. Doubtful suspicion already clouded her eyes. It was safe to assume that the secretary-looking woman was a deeply mistrusting person. Without even as much as talking, Xavier had already established himself on her bad side. At this point, if Xavier was to ever find himself in her good graces, it would take a divine intervention. With the unsettling air that hung between them, the secretary opened her documents in a bid to find even the smallest damning detail that would automatically discredit Xavier as the hero who had killed the orc chief. But it seemed like the sinister figure who stood before her was actually who he claimed to be. When she saw that all the evidence pointed to that, she reluctantly accepted that Xavier was clean. Now the secretary was a low-level mage. And because of her mage status, she used her magical side to scan people, in order for her to ascertain their levels. Therein lay her problem with Xavier. As the secretary scanned him, hoping to detect even the slightest trace of mana, she came up short with each attempt. The stranger before her hadn't even an atom of mana in his being. This can't be. She pondered to herself as she contemplated the Xavier issue. Even if he was a skilled mage who was adept at hiding his mana, and I doubt that this is the case, I should be able to detect at least a trace. She eyed Xavier warily as she continued her own internal monologue. No. This can't is the one. He must be a fraud. Yes, that's right. This must be another one of those opportunistic scammers who are up to no good. The secretary thought she had Xavier all figured out. If it were up to me, I'd have him thrown out before he wastes anyone's time with his web of untruths. But alas, it wasn't up to her. She had to stick to the rules which guided the way business was conducted, or risk getting sanctioned. Aloud, she addressed Xavier in a professional manner. Mr. Xavier, I have been sent by the higher-ups to retrieve you. Please follow me. If you have any reservations whatsoever, kindly inform me of them and I will do my best to ensure that they are taken into consideration. She spoke smartly, making sure to enunciate her words to lessen the likelihood of being misunderstood. Also, the secretary refrained from using any profane language or degrading terms. In fact, she used terminologies and office slangs, hoping that in a way, she could throw him off his game by simply being professional. Of course, there was a way she could have known that the man who stood before her was the farthest thing from an illiterate. Xavier on the other hand wasn't in the least bothered. He simply wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. So, he shrugged and grunted his agreement. The secretary read this as a confirmation of her initial suspicions. He definitely was an illiterate. The presumptuous woman assumed that he was only avoiding having an actual conversation because he had neither the words nor intellect to keep up with her. This was the worst possible case of misjudgment. Satisfied with her investigations, the secretary spoke again. This time around, she deliberately chose to use ambiguous words and extravagant terminologies. Superb. If you will be so kind as to follow me, a distinguished dignitary awaits us. Without the warmth that was typical of tour guides, the secretary turned around sharply and stormed off. Xavier wasted no time in dashing after her. The secretary walked briskly, trotting along the whitewashed marble floors of the corridors. Gliding down the passageways with the same emergency mentality that Xavier had observed was typical of this place. Eventually, after taking a few twists and a few turns through the never-ending series of intertwining corridors, they finally arrived at their destination. A very impressive-looking door hung magnificently on the door frame, hinting at the fact that a very important personality was concealed behind those very doors. Chapter 69 Dale, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Xavier watched curiously as she walked up to the door and knocked rather carefully on the door, like she didn't want to rile up the entity on the other side. After a dignified short pause, a male voice came from the other side of the door. Come in. With permission came audacity. The secretary boldly clamped her hand on the door handle and pushed it open. Xavier waited a second before following her in. He hadn't anticipated the recoil on the door to be so reactive, so Xavier almost got slammed by the closing door. He jumped into the room in the nick of time, narrowly missing the door by just a few seconds. Though Xavier couldn't prove it, he got a hunch that the secretary had done that on purpose. He may or may not have been right. But the soft smile that was threatening to pull through across the lady's face was proof enough of her involvement. The office was large and spacious. Way more spacious than the one Xavier and Adelia had been in when they first got here. In fact, it was so large that it made the other one look like a cubicle. As expected, the swanky office was well decorated. Though not as overly fixated on aesthetic beauty as the other. This particular office resonated a kind of simple, and yet sophisticated ambience. Aside from the spaciousness, one other thing that stood out the most was the extra-large mahogany desk that sat tentatively in the north section of the office. At the head of the table was a man standing in front of an equally large chair that resembled a throne. The man had his back to Xavier and the secretary, so Xavier couldn't see his face. But there was no mistaking the fact that this was indeed a boss. Even as he sensed that his two guests had entered, he still refused to acknowledge their presence with as much as a sigh or even a look. He simply remained there with their backs to him, doing whatsoever it was that he was doing. It seemed like he had been waiting for a while, quite possibly for them. The man was tall and with an equally impressive build. By rough comparison, he was about the same size as Xavier. At this point, the secretary had to break the ice. Top of the morning to you, sir. This is the man of the hour, sir. Still, there was no reply. The secretary then proceeded to introduce the mysteriously quiet man to Xavier. As was expected, she minded her tone and kept her words to the bare minimum. Mr. Xavier, may I introduce you to the Venerable Silver Knight, Dale. He among some others are the main people responsible for presenting you with this award. You will do well to show your respect. As if this was the cue he had been waiting for, the man turned around, revealing a handsome face and well-cut features. But Xavier watched as a puzzled look crept across his face very quickly. It altered his otherwise calm face, causing a ripple on the troubled waters that was now his face. The secretary noticed this and secretly rejoiced. She suspected that the Silver Knight had already used his own perception powers to scan Xavier for any sign of mana. The fact that he had none was scary to believe. For without mana, it was practically impossible for ordinary man to engage an orc in battle, much more the chief of the orcs. You've been exposed, you fraud. Elated, the secretary prepared herself mentally for the tongue-bashing that was to follow. She was particularly looking forward to his confession on just how he came about this plan to come in here and bamboozle his way through an award. The audacity was just so much. But the unfortunate secretary couldn't have been more wrong. If she had taken a closer look, she would have seen that it wasn't a look of temporary amusement. The man had gone pale just looking at Xavier for the first time. It was more of awe and shock, than disbelief and worry. The reason for this mind-numbing reaction was simple. Unlike the low-level overconfident mage that was the secretary, this particular man was a silver knight of the highest level of mage powers. So, he could see with more depth and clarity. And right now, that depth and clarity had gifted him a walking breathing nightmare. Back at the underground exchange, just as old man Caden had seen on the first day he saw Xavier, Silver Knight, Dale also saw the terrifyingly horrendous sight. Only this time, it was in a more enhanced version. The handsome Silver Knight, Dale watched with horror as what seemed like a bloody apparition played out before him. As he looked at Xavier, his vision registered a very dark, crimson blood-red aura around Xavier. But like a forest fire that was raging without the actual burning heat, the Silver Knight couldn't trace any single atom of mana in his body. It was shocking, it was disturbing, and it was no doubt the weirdest anomaly he had ever encountered. The raging blood-red aura was like an intangible halo of shadows of raging dragons surrounding Xavier. The Silver Knight couldn't exactly place what it was or what its source was, but he could most definitely sense it. Sensing the drama that was about to unfold, the secretary excused herself promptly. Her wrongly interpretation of the strange expression on the face of the Silver Knight caused her to make another error in judgment. So, relieved that someone else had caught on to his antics, she left feeling reassured that this lying bum from the countryside would definitely suffer the punishment he had so aptly garnered for himself. The pessimistic secretary closed the door behind her and left the men to their endeavors. Dale wasn't just a glorified Silver Knight, he was also a seasoned statesman who was well versed in the art of politics. But despite all this achievements under his belt, he was the farthest thing from a senseless, clueless and spontaneous villain. No. If he anything, he was actually the opposite. His cool-headedness and objective way of thinking and doing things made him appear to be an extremely shrewd man in the sight of others. So, having found himself in quite the conundrum, he put his very analytical mind to good use and began the sorting process. He pondered on this new development over and over again in his mind. He doubted that there was any material or manual in all the earth that could offer him the guidance he needed at this moment. As he weighed the matter on the scales in his heart, after much permutation and combination, he came up with two possible solutions. The first possibility was one that just had to be considered given the nature of man. It was highly unlikely, but it had to be on the table for the purpose of elimination. The possibility that Xavier was in fact a deceitful con artist who merely wanted to wrangle his way into the good graces of the government. This possibility was very unlikely. As a man with experience, Dale knew that the primary motivation for most con artists was money. For a con artist to risk getting in the spotlight with the government, then it had to be the haul of a lifetime. Dale examined this angle thoroughly and finally came to the conclusion that this wasn't the case with Xavier. The second possibility, however, was even more unbelievable, and the likelihood of it being true was pretty slim. The second possibility was that he was in fact a unicorn, that is a rare prodigy, a hidden master who had perfected the art of completely ridding himself of any and all traces of mana. This concept blew Dale's mind to bits. It was primarily because mana was the basic requirement for any practicing mage. This whole concept was mind-blowing. If this was truly the case, then, well. Faced with the ever-daunting challenge of having to discern a man's true nature, Dale's shrewdness prevailed and he decided to put the young man who stood before him to a test. Dale made a conscious decision not to be carried away by the impressive aura of the stranger. There was no denying the fact that his spiritual presence alone was terrifying. There was also the stranger's reputation, which seemed to be all-encompassing. There were tales of him slaughtering an entire group of goblins, stories of him sending a whole tribe of orcs running, and of course, the crowning achievement. The very interesting story of him single-handedly killing the notorious chief orc. All of these were glowing recommendations, and his terrifying blood-red aura only enhanced his already mysterious profile. But despite all of these neatly stacked portfolio, Dale just couldn't resist finding out for himself. He just had to be sure. Chapter 70 Feeler. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Well, if indeed he is who he claims to be, I don't think he would be rattled by a little test. The Silver Knight's mind was always plotting and counter-plotting. So, when an alarm bell sounded at the back of his mind, warning him that his plan could very well backfire, he took it into due consideration. It was very conceivable that there was every tendency that he could end up annoying a hidden master, consequently placing himself on the receiving end of a master's wrath. Dale gritted his teeth. He felt like he was between a mountain and a sea, and in the very middle was a narrow bridge whose end disappeared in the thick fog of the unknown. Caution was called for. But Dale just had to know the truth. All of these thoughts and simulations flew about with lightning speed and on a quantum level in his mind. So, after a few, rather brief and rather awkward, seconds of staring at Xavier, he put on the deliberate fuzzy warmth of a polite host and welcomed Xavier. In a hearty booming voice, and with a conciliating smile that looked particularly forced, Dale greeted Xavier. "Mr. Xavier, I wish to formally welcome you to the great Victoria City." Forcing his body language to comply with his hospitality, Dale reached out across the table with an outstretched arm, gesturing for a handshake. Xavier was a soldier at heart whose entire character had been built on the simple direct style of communication between his fellow soldiers and superiors. Because of this, he wasn't exactly keen on picking up on the dubiousness of certain people, specifically of the ruling political class, who were adept at masking their intentions behind warm gestures and beaming smiles. So, for the poor Xavier, the obvious politicking going on in the room missed him. This was why he had no reason to be suspicious of the seemingly innocent handshake that the Silver Knight had so sweetly offered him. In fact, Xavier welcomed it. It was a refreshing change of pace compared to the coldness and vitriol that had been targeted at him from the first two people he had interacted with here. So, completely oblivious of the fact that he was indeed a suspect in the mind of the Silver Knight, Xavier stepped forward casually in a bid to meet the other man halfway to shake his hand. In those short but brief nanoseconds before Xavier's hands made impact with the other man's hands, if he had been a little bit more sensitive to the seemingly placid atmosphere in the room, he would have detected an underlying foul gas of suspicion that was covered by the fake fragrance of hospitality. If Xavier had paid a little bit more attention to the well-built man who was positioned before him at the head of the mahogany desk, standing confidently, beaming a warm smile and holding out what appeared to be a simple hand waiting for a handshake, Xavier would have been able to see a different picture. In that brief moment, the Silver Knight's dark eyes bore a sinister semblance to that of a desert viper. The corners of his mouth was twisted at the edges, suggesting the fact that his smile wasn't from his heart. A matured mind would have discerned these unsettling signs. But for ostensible reasons, Xavier took the bait. It wasn't really his fault, the Silver Knight had years of experience in this game of cloak and daggers. Xavier might have been a skillful killer with a terrifyingly intimidating bloodthirsty aura, but he was yet to tango with a creature of this caliber. This made Xavier, on some level, the clueless underdog. The moment Dale had been waiting for finally came. Almost as if time had slowed down just for this moment, the Silver Knight watched in slow motion as the man with the viciously aggressive, blood-red aura waltzed towards him, as if he was gliding across the surface of the floor, and clasped his hand unsuspectingly. Both men shared the same handshake, but at the same time, in some vicious twist of fate, both men felt completely different things from the same handshake. For Xavier, it felt like he had been hit with a surge of electricity. Oddly enough, it didn't course through the entirety of his body like the relentless blast of the merciless electrons that would normally rage through a conductor upon contact with an electrical source. No, this was different, this feeling was restricted solely to his palm. For a brief moment, Xavier felt like his hand had been placed inside a powerfully charged electromagnetic force field. The feeling was akin to being right on top of a power source. Xavier's instincts screamed at him to retrieve his hands immediately, but his will prevailed. Instead, Xavier struggled desperately to remember the first time he had felt something akin to this feeling. Still bravely clasping the man's hand, Xavier bravely held on until his mind brought to being from the chronicles of his memories, the one memory that felt so familiar to this particular encounter. One name stood out, echoing and echoing till Xavier couldn't ignore it anymore. Caden. Bedouin. Finally, Xavier recalled the familiar incident and juxtaposed it with his present situation. Xavier remembered with vivid details the day he met Caden, the brief surge of energy that was purely psychic in nature. This particular stunt that had been executed sloppily by Caden had been deftly executed by this impressive character. Both Caden's and Dale's intentions had been the same. To test the bounds of Xavier's strength by using some kind of spiritual pressure as a measuring tool. With Caden, Xavier had been on his toes for the first few minutes he had met him. At the time, everything about Caden had seemed just out of place. Indeed, the old man had all the likeness of a dubious character, so Xavier hadn't been taken unawares. But with this silver-tongued silver knight called Dale, Xavier saw a different shade of the word subtle. Up until this very moment, Xavier assumed that this level of sneakiness was a trait that was exclusive to the members of the female demographic. He had been totally caught off guard. But even half aware, Xavier's subconscious was still very much alert. Instinctively, with the dazzling speed of a jaguar that had come under attack, the jungle cat in Xavier arose from its deep slumber. His ever-present undying hatred of losing surfaced and took over, expelling every trace of weakness and filling Xavier with the strength and mental fortitude he needed to put the Silver Knight in his place. So, maintaining a solid jawline and a rock-hard expression, Xavier's steely gaze met the piercing eyes of the perceptive Silver Knight. And so, locked in what appeared to be a harmless handshake, the battle of will began. Anyone with average powers of reasoning who was unlucky enough to walk in at that moment would have seen nothing more than two grim-faced men shaking hands. But a more astute mind would take one look at both men and see the hidden writing on the wall. Fueled by his crushing desire to come out victorious, Xavier used his strength to resist and suppress the pressure building up in the Silver Knight's hand like a sick wave, dangerously gaining momentum by the second. As the silent battle between both men raged on, it soon became obvious that both sides were evenly matched. Both men were unyielding, both men were stubborn. But the logical conclusion after their first bout was that neither of them could really do anything to the other. By all count, they were evenly matched. The balance was just uncanny. Xavier might have been the one who had been taken off guard at first, but by the end of the whole ego-measuring contest, Dale ended up being the one who was surprised. His heart raced with all the possible inferences. Dale was known for his foresight and relatively objective style of thinking, but there was no way he could have anticipated that an ordinary-looking chump like Xavier would match his strength in a hand grip. Incredible. He wondered inwardly, all the while keeping a straight face. Truly remarkable. No mana whatsoever, and yet, with nothing but brute force he managed to remain unfazed. Dale began to wonder what exactly his full strength would look like if he actually unleashed his hidden mana. He shuddered inwardly at the mere thought of it. Finally, a silent understanding passed between the two men. There was no need to drag it out any longer than was necessary. Silently, they came to a mutual understanding that it was time to let go. Their firm grasp on each other's hands relaxed, and they both let out a sigh of relief, almost simultaneously. Having tested the waters, both men now regarded each other differently. Although they didn't openly acknowledge each other, but it was more than obvious that they now knew and saw each other for the person they truly were, or at least appeared to be.